So what we'll do is the same protocol. We have Holly and with microphones, but I do want to ask really quickly two clarifying questions. And one is it's almost like the news side and the engagement policy side. The first one is for the news side because, of course, the data is always most interesting when it completely contradicts your intuitions. And Duncan, you said something about news really being TV. And I was hoping you can disentangle that for us a little bit more. And I would love to, of course, hear Christie's response to that, since you're not in TV,
Right,
but in news. So just a little bit more on that, maybe.
Well, I mean, this was a very surprising result to us. I mean, we certainly, were motivated to ask the question about, how much, because we knew about previous studies where people had been looking for filter bubbles or other kinds of things in online news, and we would talk to them about their research, and they would say things like, well, first we threw out 95% of URLs because they weren't news related. And so we kind of had a sense that but then the entire paper would be about that 5%, as if that were like 100% of the story. And so we certainly had this, prior that there was a lot of other stuff out there that we weren't talking about when we were having conversations about, this is a big problem or this is a small problem. But when we actually sort of, put everything in an apples to apples metric of which is basically just minutes per person per day that you spend doing X versus Y, it was pretty striking that the consumption of news on television is at least an order of magnitude greater than consumption of news online, which includes both desktop and mobile. So it's just sort of the opposite of what the conversation is in both the journalistic world and also in the research literature. Now, of course, you can argue about but people are way more engaged in the stuff that they read online. They've just got the TV on in the background and they're not really paying attention. I think that's not how advertisers think about impact and engagement. I think that that if you look at how much money is spent advertising on TV, it's way more than is spent online still. So I'm not sure that I buy that argument. Also, Nielsen takes a lot of precautions in its TV panel to make sure that people are actually watching when they're being metered. If you don't sort of respond for a certain period of time, they ping you and ask you if you're still there. And so they have lots of checks for doing this. So you could argue that in spite of all of that, it just matters more what you see online. But I think then you have to show that, right? And so we're just measuring time. We can't really sort of talk about influence yet. But I think that it certainly poses the question that we really have to if you want to continue to believe that what's happening online is the stuff that matters most, the burden of proof is now shifted to demonstrating that that's a positive rather than just assuming it.
Could you say a little bit more about the data that you were presenting, where they came from or how they were collected? I'm just curious, because I know that with online, it's always tricky to really which statistics do you rely on, and I'm just curious how you're sort of being sure that you're capturing everyone, or how do we? There's sort of a data problem here that I think is universal. And I'm thinking of it in terms of coming from 538, where the methods of polling are starting to change now because people don't have landlines and things like that. And I'm wondering how you sort of reconcile that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not. I'll start off by saying nothing is perfect, but that's true of everything. I mean, that's true of every measurement that we rely on. So the Nielsen. Most of the data is from Nielsen. So we have the web, the national TV panel, which is their sort of gold standard product that that is used to measure audience for advertising purposes. So this is something that the entire industry uses as a way of pricing advertising. So they put a lot of money into making sure that this is a nationally representative panel, and they have each individual member in a household is got different codes to log in and to be metered separately. So that's sort of the first panel. The second panel is related to that, but is sort of treated separately, which is the local news consumption, the local TV panel, which is the 25 top local TV markets in the country. And we use that basically just to measure the local news consumption because we thought that was very important, which, as it turns out, it is. The third panel is their web panel, which is a totally separate thing, where again, you put special software on your computer, and it basically logs everything that you do. And we have sort of every single URL visited by each member of the household and how long they spend on it, and what the referral URL was. And so there's a lot of it's very, very granular data, but it's just desktop, right? So of course, that's a huge missing data problem right there. And so that's where the fourth panel comes in, which is ComScore data, which does separately measure desktop and mobile. But the ComScore data is not an individual level; it's at the site level. So we basically use the ComScore data to recalibrate the Nielsen data so that we can do everything at the individual level. So yes, there is some assemblage there, and clearly along the way we have to make some assumptions. And so what we've done for this analysis is to essentially take the upper bound estimate that we can for both fake news and for real news, so that if we're making a mistake, right, it has to be in the direction such that everything is smaller than we're claiming that it is.
As some of you are thinking about follow-up questions to this, and if you could raise your hand, I can't see people, especially if they're sitting close to the spotlights here. But I do want to ask the what I call the policy engagement side. I really liked, Anne, how you set up the what some people have called the idea of a wicked problem, a problem that hopefully is informed by the best available science, but ultimately will require a societal solution that needs balancing of values, of political considerations, of regulatory constraints, and the best available science. And it's like you were talking about, this engagement science, and of course public engagement being a term that's very familiar to many of the people in the room. So are there good models to learn from, both from the business world in terms of how to engage with stakeholder audiences, or from health communication? Especially as it comes to those wicked problems, right, where we're really engaging on much more than just the science, even though we really are only experts. Many of us are really just experts in the scientific, on the scientific side of things, but values obviously are things that may be more important in some of those decisions.
Sure. So I think the answer to this is that we need to understand how people experience every day and what they need. They are looking for us for answers. And there are wicked problems, but I think the local point is really, really important. We talk about global and ecosystem, and that's really incredibly difficult for people to comprehend. And they're focusing on what happened in the real life, and they have real world problems, and they're trying to really navigate the challenges that they experience. And they're looking for us, okay, so if you cannot give me an answer, why do I need you here to some extent, right? And it doesn't have to be answering this big question about what is moral or immoral, but really basically giving them information and knowledge. So I'll give an example. The town hall meetings, we have a Q&A session at the end of that, and we content analyze the Q&A session because what we were interested in information gaps. And it turns out that we told them about opioid addiction and how you get addicted, and we did all the science thing that we're supposed to do. And then the question that came back was, so if my son got addicted, how do I get treatment? Where do I find this information? The policymaker asked me the question, if I pass the medical marijuana legislation, is that going to take care of the problem of opioid addiction? Okay, do you have any evidence that you can use and so forth? And sometimes we realize that whatever we're studying, my conclusion for my own research project was that policymakers want a lot of information about implementation. They want about the feasibility, they want about the political cost and so forth. That information is not available because we're not collecting that. We're very good about collecting information about problems and describing problems and suggesting solutions. But when it comes to implementation, that's where things fall apart, and that's happened to be what's really important for people and to make decisions. And I think that's where you bridge that piece, go thinking local, thinking from the perspective of people themselves. And that's our opportunity, I would argue, to engage with them and show them the value of scientific thinking and science.
I guess I would say one of the models, and we tend to think more empirically maybe than theoretically about these things, but one of the models that we've used a lot is stakeholder engagement, and that's run the gamut from a global advisory group. I remember one time as I went in to present, I was warned, look, if half of them don't threaten to resign by the time you're done, we'll be okay. That's really confidence building, right? But these were external, they were academics, they were from NGOs, former government officials that come in and would advise us on really thorny problems. That's kind of a global perspective. Running to sort of the other end of that continuum where you're dealing with the community, and we might be collecting comment cards with a commitment that we were going to give an online written response to every single card that was submitted, or you put them into breakout groups with facilitators of maybe 5 or 6 people, and we are going to get every question that you have. This deal of how do you engage with people and get out from their perspective what they're most concerned about, which again, very often when you do that, it's not a scientific problem. It's something different that needs to be addressed, but somehow you've got to get that on the table or you really can't move forward.
But
Go ahead.
most scientific controversies are not about science, though, and in fact, more science actually makes them worse because the science becomes polarized and whatnot. And I think it's really important to acknowledge and to understand in these circumstances that science can inform these decisions, but it's the values that are going to be, and if people's values are different, you can't, I mean, there's been a lot of talk, there's someone said something earlier, information is not enough to get people to do what we want, but it may be that we're not going to be able to do them if their values are different. And I think that sometimes you need to acknowledge that. And there's this idea that, if we can just get them the facts, but that's not going to change that, what they're, so I'll just give you an example. Right now, I'm in Colorado. There's some legislation that I believe just passed. I think our new governor, Polis, is going to sign it, that's about regulating fracking and drilling and stuff. And so this legislation would give local communities more say. It's sort of, it basically creates new rules that are sort of in favor of the precautionary principle, sort of being more cautious with stuff and protecting, taking health risks and things like this into effect when they're making decisions. And the industry is saying this is going to kill the oil and gas industry, and so communities that rely on those are really against it. And there's a lot of things, and so you can look at, there have been some media stories about, okay, what are the facts here? What do we actually know about what this might do? But that's not going to change anyone's mind because it's really about, which do you value more, these jobs or, having drilling near to a school? And some of that may depend on, whether you have those jobs in your family or what community you live in. And so the facts aren't going to really shift the conversation. And so unless you're having a conversation that's about those values and really putting those to the forefront, which tends to be a really difficult thing to do.
And there's also an interesting, I think, area of research, social science research emerging on how to depolarize, if we have those discussions, how to avoid falling into the trap of more information feeding more polarization. And Duncan, maybe you want to comment on that.
I don't disagree with the sort of global comment that just sort of adding more information is sort of in some sense solving for the wrong problem. But I also think that there are some sort of what we sometimes refer to as values maybe just sort of the cognitive limitations that people have trouble, everybody, all of us, scientists, non-scientists, have trouble thinking about consequences that are distant in time and that are not immediate to ourselves, right? So, climate change is sort of the ultimate wicked problem because it's incredibly diffuse. There's sort of nothing that you individually can do about it. And, it's this sort of terrible thing that may happen at some time in the future to everybody. But now you have to sort of make a sacrifice, right now in a way that could affect you. So actually I think one thing that we could be trying harder to do is sort of develop strategies for helping people to understand collective problems that we don't, it's not something that comes naturally. Vaccines has a similar challenge that you're worried about your child, but what is this herd immunity thing that all epidemiologists keep going on about? I mean, it's a real thing. It really matters, but it matters at a level of analysis that doesn't make intuitive sense to us. So, helping people to sort of work through that kind of cause and effect chain, I think could be really impactful. I mean, of course, I have no idea how to do that, but so I'm actually just one quick thing that my colleague Dan Goldstein has done some interesting work about the time factor, which is a very clever trick where he's interested in people saving more for their retirements. And so what he did was he took a picture, got them to take a picture of themselves, and then he artificially aged their picture so they could see themselves in the future as an old person who might need retirement benefits. And this sort of helped collapse the time discounting, so that people subsequently were willing to invest more in their retirement benefits. And I think Merrill Lynch actually picked that up and has that as a thing that they use, of course, without attributing Dan's research. So that's sort of something where you can sort of do something about the time, but it's like very, doing something about like, well, you have to do this thing because of everybody. That's a tricky one.
Mm-hmm. I think we have at least one question to start out with, and I would remind you to keep it short, ideally, and introduce yourself before asking the question. So please.
Hello. Okay. Hi, I'm Norm Sakuda. I'm from the Petroleum Technology Research Center in Saskatchewan in Canada. What do you think of the strategy which CBC and other news outlets have used of not allowing comments at the end of stories? One thing, just a qualification for that I've noticed is that many people now share those stories, since they can't comment at the site, on their own social media and have more civil discussions about them. So I'm just wondering, is that an effective strategy on the part of media outlets to stop commentary at the end of their articles?
Yeah, a lot of places have done that. I believe The Atlantic has done that as well. I mean, as a writer, I like that because for the reasons. Although, like I said, I was surprised when I really took a deeper look at 538's comments. I mean, one of the issues though is that I don't have time to engage there, and so I actually prefer. So when people email me, I always at least read them. I don't always have time to answer all of them, but that's a better way to actually get through to me. But I found that social media has taken over some of this now, where people are discussing things there, which can be better or worse, because that can really degenerate very fast too. I think the issue here, I think that there is the possibility to have an opportunity there for the comments to be something productive. The problem, and this is why it's not happening, is that takes staffing. You basically need someone on staff to be moderating those things, to be sort of policing it, to be, there are different strategies now where I think that the Washington Post, maybe Laura could correct me if I'm wrong, has a policy where people who are sort of frequent commenters, you can sort of earn badges and help rate people or do, am I right that there's like some sort of community help they're doing?
Something like that. We've been highlighting the top comments, picking out particularly interesting or informative ones, and putting them to the top of the comment stream.
Yeah. And the New York Times does something a little bit similar. And so I think that, if all the media, it's sort of, media is so pinched right now that that's just not going to be where the top priority. But it's kind of a missed opportunity in my view.
Yeah, and just on a historical note, actually, I think at the very first Sackler Colloquium on the Science of Science Communication, just during that time, my colleague Dominique Broussard and I had a piece on what we call the nasty effects of this idea that uncivility or uncivil comments reflect, people who'd seen the exact same article but saw uncivil comments attributed lower credibility to the article itself and ended up more polarized on the science. So in other words, a news organization is providing space for those kinds of exchanges and may pay for it with credibility, just if people start yelling at each other. And as a result, during Sackler 1, I think, or the Science of Science Communication, the first meeting, Popular Science kind of led the charge by at least temporarily closing down their comment section. A lot of others followed. And I think the shift to social media with those platforms being much more prepared for that kind of debate, and without that direct feedback loop to the news organization itself, that of course also incurs a lot of cost for doing 24/7 moderation. I think was part of it.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point, and that is, I don't want my stories being cluttered at the bottom with like, I said all this stuff, and now someone's saying, oh, that's not credible, or bringing up, fringe theories and things like that. And I do think that that's something you don't want associated. And I'll just say, I wrote a story for Slate once about how my high school cross country coach was a molester and this whole ordeal I had gone through. And I actually, at one point, I hadn't been looking at the comments, but a friend had alerted me that there was actually this whole conversation going on in the comments section that was getting very personal to me about like trying to figure out my age and like what school I had gone to and things like that. So it can be a little bit frightening. And there are thankfully has not happened to me, but I have friends who've been doxxed and things like this, and that kind of goes beyond comments. But there is sort of an issue of you want to facilitate engagement, but you also want to be careful and you want to protect your journalists too, so that we're not being harassed.
You want to?
So I want to point out that what's interesting here is what we're missing in terms of conversations, right? So the question I think we have in terms of public engagement is, where's the conversation that matters take place? And if we think about comments as these people who are highly motivated, and you find out yourself, and we know that, ego-involved people, we have that fancy word we use, people who already care about a topic, they invested in that and so forth, are more likely to comment on that, then we're not really opening it to democracy. People should have an opportunity to express their concerns and the topic they care about and so forth. And one of the things that I think there was a question yesterday that talks about what is the role of news media in this? It's a two-way communication. So role of news media or good investigative journalism has always been, and we wrote a paper recently that's called News Media as Knowledge Brokers, intermediaries between the public and the policy in terms of information. And one of the things that's really helped is if you go out there and collect the stories people have. What do people care about? Okay, so I remember actually vividly NPR, because I think the question came from an NPR reporter during the 2016 elections. If you listen carefully to NPR and the kind of work they done in Pennsylvania and so forth, you could have actually predicted the outcome very easily, because people were very clear about what they care about. It was not about the national politics. So I think part of that is, where's the conversation that matters, because we need potentially to be part of that conversation. It might not be happening with people who are highly motivated on particular topics. I just want to throw it out because, that Vish talks about very nicely yesterday about the disparities and how we close disparities. And communication disparities are really, really important. We need to have a venue for people to feed us with information. I think the news media has a really important role in that.
Question? Yeah.
Yeah, Rick Weiss from the Sideline at AAAS. Just to bring up a little bit of a counterpoint to your data, Duncan, it may be that we're putting too much emphasis on this little slice of area where the fake news thing is happening, and most people are getting their news from local news. But local news, TV news, is not where people are getting their science news from. And when people are looking for information about science, about health, about environment, they're not getting it from their local television stations. And so that's it's a separate problem that I think needs to be addressed, not to correct wrong information in that medium, but to actually start injecting some of that information into that medium in the first place. We know this a little bit from the Pew Research data and others, but also from personal experience. I and my team have been traveling around the country the last few months, visiting newsrooms all over the country, and we visit local TV stations and ask them, what was the last science or medicine story that you've done? And they'll say things like, oh, we did a story about this local guy who has the biggest rubber band ball, and that was our science story. And there's like no science there at all.
It's funny. I would say that about the New York Times.
It could have been a science story, but it wasn't.
So I mean, you're probably right that there's not much science on TV. I would say there's not much science anywhere, and no one is reading it. So if you think that fake news is a small slice of what people are consuming online, I could go back there and try to find the science component, but you wouldn't be able to see that either. So the bottom line is no one is consuming science, and probably not very much is being produced anywhere, and the quality that is being produced is not very good. So I think we have a big problem there. I think everybody has that problem, not just television.
So I just want to jump in here for a second and maybe be a little contrarian. I think it's not true that I think that medical and sort of personal health and things like this are very popular and they're pretty widespread. And those local TV news programs may not be doing good reporting, but I bet most of them have done something about local guy had this disease and was doing like these things make the news. And most local newspapers and things like this will have some, and oftentimes it will be sponsored by the hospital who's trying to sell their expensive equipment, tests and things. But those sorts of stories are very popular. And if you just go to the newsstand and look at glossy magazines, all of those fashion magazines and things like this will have health stories. Again, they may not be written by science writers, they may not be well informed, but this is stuff, people do have an appetite for this stuff on the internet. These are very popular stories. And so although we may not think of them directly as science, people are being exposed to some of this stuff.
Okay, so this is a perfect, just to make a meta point here. Like this is exactly the kind of argument that we would like to settle, right? Because you've got your personal anecdotal experience of the world that informs your view of how things are, and you have a different experience of the world that informs how you, and we can just go around and have this argument all day long, and we will never settle it. And the only way to do it is to construct the kind of data platform that we're trying to build here, where we could say, okay, let's go look. Let's go, code everything for science, and let's take all the closed caption TV data and break everything into segments and count the number of science segments and count the words, and then we can do fact checking on that, and we can do the same thing for various media outlets online, and we can actually sort of answer the question about what is being produced, how is it being covered, is it accurate, are people reading it, what are they getting from it? This is where science can help, is to say, we don't just have to have this argument about what the media is saying and what people are getting from it. We can go measure this stuff. And so it's difficult to do. Again, we spent 2 years building the plumbing, but I think we can start to do it now.
Well, and it's important to answer some of these questions with data rather than ideas. I think we have some good examples of where the media goes wrong when we sort of, assume we know what's going on or use anecdotes instead of deeper data.
Yep.
Andy.
Andy Hoffman from the University of Michigan. I'm listening to this conversation and the presentations and wondering if there's something here that can inform future Sackler Colloquia. The idea that science is necessary but not sufficient, not sufficient, that we have to speak to values, that those are the core issues. And yet I've had some back and forth on what we're doing here. The science of science communication, like science is going to teach us how to communicate. Science is going to teach us how to be genuine, how to be authentic, how to be accessible. And that in itself is a contradiction. And so it's almost like we have to teach people how to stop being scientists and being humans again, to communicate effectively. And so is there a tension in the whole idea of this colloquium of just science is going to solve the problem of communicating science?
I have a quick comment on this. I kept noticing again and again, yesterday in particular, examples of there's sort of this idea that like science can solve it, science knows what we should do, and so we're trying to communicate the science to people so that they can tell you, and it's very much about telling them what to do with these behaviors that we want from them. But sometimes science doesn't have, part and parcel with this is that sometimes, and I will just say that science communication, particularly like with public health and things, has a long history of overselling things. I've written a tremendous amount about cancer screening. This is a really good example where we have this messaging that is completely misaligned with the actual evidence. And it has this long history, but it's been going for so long, and it's been so effective at convincing the public that if they get screened for cancer, they will save their lives, despite the fact that the evidence actually does not, for the most part, support that. It's really hard to take that back, but you also have this idea that like science knows what people should do, and science has the answer. And this goes back to something that I was trying to convey yesterday, which is that science is not an answer, it's a process. And so, the things that we know now are always have to be open to change and things like that. And so there's almost like, I wonder if we need a little bit more humility too in these communications, where this is the best that we know right now. There may be new evidence to where what we're telling you to do right now is going to change. But this idea that science knows what people should do and knows what people will want to do if they were fully informed of the science. Because sometimes, an example that I can think of from yesterday, someone had put up a slide of some protests in Puerto Rico during the Zika breakout, where there was some spraying for mosquitoes. And so the idea here was like, of of course you want to spray for mosquitoes, Zika is a really important problem, but science doesn't tell us that. Science tells us that there are trade-offs, and it may be that, you know, the trade-offs are really stacked in one direction where it seems obvious that you would want to make a decision to do one thing and not another, but those are value judgments, and I think it's really important to recognize that, and I think that's where it's different. As a journalist, my job is not to decide to tell people what they should do. I'm about, you know, looking at the evidence and also, you know, frankly, calling bullshit when scientists are saying things that are incorrect or you know, doing bad things.
And I'll make your, I'll rephrase what you said a little bit more, and then we'll get to Itzhak as well. But the, you know, and this is an issue that has come up before at previous colloquia. Are we knowledge deficiting science communication, right? Everybody's saying, well, here's what you don't know about science communication. If you only knew it, you would be a better communicator. So just to reframe that a little bit. And I think that's a fair point to a degree, but I think it assumes that the science of science communication is the only part that matters here. And I think we have a few examples that we heard about already. Elliot Kirshner yesterday talked about the Wonder Collaborative, right? And for me, that's a really good example. I think the Rita Allen Foundation has supported folks at WGBH who are embedded as scientists in a news organization. So what's the point of this? The point of this is that a lot of it, and we'll talk about at the end of the day about partnerships and building partnerships. And that's really, I think, this, in many ways, a path forward where we're bringing together the bench sciences, who may be good at communicating, but may also not be, but certainly very often bring in expertise that is really important for a scientific topic. The social sciences that can help us assess effectiveness, that can tell us if we actually, you know, settle those questions that we all have an intuition on. But then also, you know, filmmakers, folks who have ways of creatively conveying aspects of science that neither the social science nor the bench science can or should have expertise in to the degree that those communities have. So that's at least a triangle, probably a bigger shape, but I think those partnerships are really the ones where we're bringing in expertise, and expertise, I mean, in a very broad sense, and including artistic expertise, that helps us do this jointly. But I very much appreciate the avoiding the deficit model of the science of science communication, because
Yeah,
I do think that is a point well taken. But then Itzhak, and then we'll move over here.
Can I just jump in?
Absolutely.
Oh.
Go ahead, Duncan, and then we'll go to Itzhak as a final word.
I would just, I've been thinking about this through several of the discussions in the last 2 days, but I think that many of the problems that we are concerned about could be traced back to the mode of production of science, which is the published paper, right? And this is sort of, you know, I mean, this was drummed into me in graduate school that your job is not done until the paper is finished, right, and published. And we really have this mentality that, like, you know, this thing goes off into the world, the ship sails, and now we move on to the next project. And I think that this has a lot of negative consequences. You know, we talked yesterday about, you know, how journalists focus too much on individual results and not enough on sort of overall bodies of knowledge. But we do the same thing, because everything is about, you know, this unit of production that, you know, gets attention and impact and citations, and that's how we, you know, we count lines on CVs and we count citations. So everything, you know, we're completely motivated to publish the paper, but we don't worry about whether that paper addresses concerns in other fields where it's completely inward-looking and concerned with the priorities of our sort of professional colleagues. It contributes to replication problems, and it contributes to overselling, and it contributes to all of the things that we're concerned about, and it dissuades us from bothering to communicate with the rest of the world because we don't get rewarded for that, right? So I think if we want to sort of break down the barriers between the scientific process and the problems that people in the outside world care about, we have to really rethink how we are measuring productivity in science, and whether there's another kind of unit of like a solved problem, or like a impact on public opinion. I mean, these are not things that are currently sort of that you get tenure for, or that you get promoted for. But I'm not sure we can solve these other problems if we're stuck with this sort of 17th century model of putting things into a document and then publishing it in the journal.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to read your paper in Nature Human Behavior on kind of a problem-focused approach to social science, just in case you haven't seen it yet. But it's like a minute. Thank you for your patience.
So very quickly, virtually every university now would have a center for clinical translation. Right? That's really the problem, how we move it from a publication into practice. Right? That's what we're focusing on. It's what RPPs are all about and so forth. We have not created the same to harvest knowledge we have from social and behavioral science in terms of how we move it forward, okay? So oftentimes when people call me and ask for my help, it always starts with, we need help with the brochure. Well, you got it wrong, okay? Because communication science tells you start with the first question is, you use scientific tools to determine what the problem is, and 90% of the time, you get it wrong. Tanning bed used for kids or females, which is a major risk for cancer, if we keep telling them they're going to die in 30 years from cancer, they couldn't care less about that. But if I figure out it's about their appearance, and if I tell them that that's going to damage their appearance and show them evidence for that, they're going to stop using it immediately. I got the problem wrong, okay? So if you think about the climate, because you brought up the issue of how do I communicate about climate, which is remote, which people cannot, you build trust with people because you walk on a problem with them that they care about right now. They care about lead in the water. That's a problem that's happening right now. And if I can help them through this problem, I build trust with them that they will trust me then that something will happen in the future. So I think part of that is we actually have good scientific tools from science and social and behavioral science on how to engage people. And again, think about values, have them reconsider the values and so, not telling them what to do or giving them answers, but engaging them in finding solutions. And I think that's really what we should focus on, is we're not gonna produce answers. I'm not God, and I'm not telling people what to do. I wanna try to make sure that they use the best possible evidence when they make decisions, because I know from research that that's gonna improve the life outcomes. That's the only thing that I do. So I think there is a room for science here.
Thank you for being so patient.
Is it on?
Oh, it is.
Okay. I just found out that one of the
Mind introducing
downsides
yourself?
of
I'm
being
sorry.
okay. Uni Blake with the American Petroleum Institute. What I was going to say, I just found out one of the downsides of being at a conference with communicators is that we communicate a lot, which is great, but what it's done, my question is probably from about 10 minutes ago, so for that I apologize. So I just wanted to let Anne know that I really appreciate your presentation. It's very rare that industry is given a platform to give our perspective on issues. So I do work for the oil and gas industry, so I know where Christy's coming from. I appreciate the way you talked about how industry has has gone through this transition where we thought science could answer everything, and then along the line we realized that there is a role for science has a smaller role than we thought it had to play. But my challenge is how do I bring people to that table? I've been at this conference for a couple of days, and I've talked to people from academia and from NGOs. But the moment we say that, I would like to collaborate with you, we're willing to fund, or we can fund through some other channel, which means we don't get the recognition that this is an issue that's important to us. So I don't know how to overcome that. I mean, talking to the public is a lot easier. We engage a lot with the public, but when it comes to people in the professional field, they're afraid of professional suicide for engaging with the industry. So I would just like some kind of thoughts and feedback on that. It's like, how do we overcome that?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank the organizers of this that invited us to participate and thought there would be value in that perspective. So the credit for that goes to them. In terms of engagement, obviously a number of important stakeholders are very skeptical of engaging with us. We've been turned down a lot of times. Where it's been successful is where it's been beneficial to both. I also think you have to be patient. You don't build trust off of one conversation, and you don't build a project off a couple of interactions and engagements. That takes time for people to understand and believe what your motivations are and that there's really something beneficial to both sides. And those aren't always going to work. We've had some talk in the abstract here where literally years were put in and they fell apart. A couple of years go by, it comes back together. But if you don't have a mutual benefit and a mutual trust on both sides, I think, again, at some point, you just need to walk away. You're not going to be able to work with everyone, and it's not going to be successful working with everyone. So you're just going to have to work with what you have.
I think we have time for one, or I don't know where we're going next. Right there, and then, so we have, if you can keep it short, that'd be great, because we're almost out of time.
I'll try to keep it short. Hi, Joe Whitty. I'm a contractor with JPL NASA, worked with NASA Goddard in getting stories out to TV weather forecasters. We have some real data for you, thanks to now 4 NSF grants starting in 2009, working with TV forecasters, producing stories about climate change, along with our partner Climate Central. And we started with one TV meteorologist in 2009. Through iterative processes, we've grown, and now Climate Central has over 650 TV forecasters who are engaged in climate change science stories for their viewers. Some of these on TV, some of these on the internet, some of these on social media, and it's a great project and will provide you probably with some very interesting data. We have many channels, many different audiences, and local TV provides a very important channel for a large majority of people. Admittedly, the stories are short, they're headlines, but it's climate change is real, it's now, it's here, it's important, and we do have solutions. Simple messages repeated often by trusted sources, thanks to our friend Ed Maybach at George Mason University.
So we have maybe one question from Marty.
Marty Kaplan, Norman Lear Center. This is for Yitzhak. Most of what you talked about had to do with people's personal behavior and their responsibility for it. But the social determinants of health are so important. We know that zip code is probably the best predictor. So what about racism, unemployment, despair, and all the other causes of ill health?
That's exactly why I'm pushing that community level engagement. I'm not engaging with individuals. I don't have time to engage with individuals. I love to. And remember, I'm not only a scientist, I'm also a parent. I'm also a community member. I also volunteer. So we wear many hats and there are a lot of opportunities. But what I find is, and I think the question that we got yesterday about scale is really, really important. How can we take something and scale it up? And I find that if I work with organizations such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, who have expertise in an area, they have an advocacy group, they have reputation, and they have the brand to engage with people about that because they generally try to help people. Or in my case, the Partnership for Drug-Free New Jersey, we've been working for 12 years together to influence policymakers and reach every single community and find it. I think I find a way, so I call it brokering, this knowledge of finding a broker. It's not necessarily practice. It's generally what we call a broker, somebody who's really who already has a relationship with the audiences, he has respect of the audiences, and I just work with them to build their capacity to serve these people better, right? And I think so, to me, that's a great model that talks about the mission of land-grant universities. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to reach out to our communities. Every state has that level. And I want to point out, in terms of local news, part of what's really important is we forget that in the national level, we have tremendous amount of resources. Policymakers on Congress have the Congressional Research Service, they have their own research arm, but state legislators don't have that. Communities don't have that capacity. And we need to provide that capacity for them. And if we do, they tend to be able to use research very well and come up with solutions to even wicked problems. And I think that's part of my model, is just not to work with individuals, but rather work with the intermediaries that connect us to communities. And I think that we build communities and we build the capacity to respond, be resilient, and so forth.
Are you saying we have time for one more question? Is that?
Thanks.
Is that all right? But
Hi,
can you
everybody.
keep it really short, please?
Ann Hayward Walker, SCA Consulting Group. So my role is helping people make real-time choices during emergencies, particularly oil spills. Science-based is ideal, but it's not always, science doesn't always address all the questions that come up on a particular incident because of all the variables of the situation. So I especially appreciate all the perspectives that you added. My question is, or I guess, or my comment is that if you're talking about people to form opinions and beliefs, which also affects their behavior, then you're really talking about choices that they'll make. And so every situation, in our experience, is that, and some of the literature shows that you really have to point out the advantages and disadvantages, or the limitations and the benefits, or whatever two labels you want to describe when you're trying to talk about trade-offs. So I guess I'd like to hear if you all have any additional insights about this idea of having science help explore the trade-offs of choices. Real time.
This is a source of a lot of research, actually, in something called patient-centered care and shared decision-making in medicine, where they're really trying, it's situations where there's a healthcare decision to be made and there isn't an obvious right answer. And so the sort of approach is to identify the patient's values and sort of what is it that they, are they more interested, some people, it may be very important to them to avoid drugs if they can. Other people may have some other values, but sort of surfacing those values and then making choices, or sort of framing those pros and cons, like you're saying, in terms of those values. And that seems like potentially an approach that might be useful in that kind of situation.
Go ahead.
We talk a lot about science in this colloquium. People sort of use the word a lot to sort of probably mean many different things. I would like to talk about measurement, right? I mean, because measurement is sort of something that we often overlook in the social sciences, but in the history of science, measurement, the ability to measure things, has been a tremendous driver of science. And I think, the presentation I gave was really meant to illustrate that when you measure things, it changes your conception of the problem, right? So the set of choices that become available to you look different after you actually see what's going on, rather than just what you imagine you would see if you went and looked, which is often what we do in policy. And so Marty asked about communities. It reminded me of some great work by Matt Desmond, a sociologist at Princeton, who has studied eviction. And he and his research team have spent a tremendous amount of time compiling this database of all evictions across the country, which is not something anybody was actually doing. And it turns out that when you look at communities where there are high eviction rates, it's actually just a handful of landlords. That there's a very small number, like 6 landlords in Boston who are responsible for 80% of the evictions, right? So that completely changes how you think about the problem. Like, you're sort of going there thinking about, well, what's the causes of eviction, and how do we sort of do stuff about poverty, and how do we do stuff about education, and how do we do stuff about job training and childcare? And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is 6 people, right? We can just go to them and make them stop, right? So, that's a completely, so just measuring things often, casts the problem that you think you've got in a totally different light. And I think very often we talk about social problems, we already think we know what the problem is, and we're rushing off to solve things. And this has certainly happened in the misinformation space, where people are like, oh, we have to do better media literacy for high school kids, and let's go spend millions of dollars on those programs. But if we step back and say, let's just understand what the problem is by measuring things, it really empowers our ability to actually do science in the first place.
And I just want to point out here that that's really what data journalism is about, is writing stories based on data and looking at the data to inform, even how you frame the problem or decide what to write about.
So just very quickly, there's opportunity for engagement. How many of you are using Waze to navigate? Okay, so think about the concept, right? We're taking data that we know, how data doesn't change, the road, and we're putting dynamic information what people themselves are giving us, and we're using this information collectively to inform you about decisions that you make. So I just want to suggest that's potentially a model, talk about citizen science and all this kind of, that's potentially a model of real-time surveillance, right, that we can use, and CDC has been using that to predict outbreaks of all kinds of diseases, or the flu and so forth. So there's a potential here. Or the city of Philadelphia decided they cannot screen the water for lead because they don't have enough inspectors to do that. They gave people kits. They just scan the barcode with the results, and within a day you have 1 million households being screened. So think about the potential of how we can engage people, because that data, to the extent that feeds back to them and help them make decisions, that's something that they really like.
And did you want?
I guess back to your question in your particular situation, those are crisis sorts of situations. They're chaotic. Information is often inaccurate. And I would maybe suggest that the time to think through all of this is a different time. And one of the techniques to use would be scenario planning, which invariably is not going to be the scenario you have, but hopefully it allows you or communities that you're going to engage with to step back when it's not a crisis and they've got more time to think it through and think about how they would respond and why, and that maybe that will give you better outcomes.
So before I thank the panel, and we're well over time right now, before I thank the panel, I want to quickly talk about the next step, and that is the small group discussions. Many of you, when you registered, signed up for one of 9 different small groups and topics. Many of you in this room have agreed to be moderators. If you haven't either signed up, or you may not remember what you've signed up for, in the app, when you go under schedule, you will find your assignment. If you don't have the app, Jennifer and all the staff outside would be happy to help you. The small groups are actually fulfill, hopefully, at least 2 purposes, hopefully more. One is to allow you and smaller groups to work through problems and kind of really dig deeper into problems that are relevant to you as a group. But also, or as a community of practice, but also, I mentioned yesterday in the morning the standing committee that the National Academies within DBAS has created, and we're really looking for input, and we're really looking for kind of outside expert advice on the kinds of questions, agenda items, potential activities, and so on that would be particularly useful for different communities of practice and research moving forward. So we'll also, as all the conversations are being recorded and reported back, this will really help us to navigate next steps and think ahead. So again, your app should tell you where to go. If not, all the staff are here to help. I'm just going to make an executive decision, given how much we went over, that we start at 10:10 rather than 10 o'clock. So if you could be in your small groups at 10 after 10, that would be great. And now please join me in thanking the panel for what I thought was a fascinating session.